So, welcome everyone from wherever you are joining us in the world today. Thank you for joining this program. My name is Brian. I'm the host of this webinar series. So this session today is part of an ongoing series by the LSE Hayek Programme, hosted by the Research Institute Stickert at the London School of Economics. The aim of this online webinar series is to explore a range of interdisciplinary topics that are related in some way, directly or indirectly, to the intellectual contributions of the economist F.A. Hayek. These include individualism and economic freedom, the nature and future of liberal democracy, social justice and welfare, decision-making under radical uncertainty and complex conditions, macroeconomic management, the rule of law and social justice, and others. Before I introduce our speaker for today, I also want to share that the next webinar session that we are organizing is at the end of this month on the 30th of July, titled The Case Against Nationalism, which I think is quite timely considering recent political news. So see the link in the chat box, which I will share shortly. For today's session, we're very pleased to have with us today Dr. Pablo Paniagua. Pablo is an economist and a research fellow at King's College London. He is also a professor of political economy and director of the Masters in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics program at Universidad del Desarrollo. He received his PhD in political economy from the University of London and his master's in science and engineering and finance at Politecnico di Milano. His research engages with broad economic and political questions at the intersections of politics, philosophy, and economics, PPE. He's the author of over 30 articles, essays, and books dealing with various aspects of political economy, philosophy, and the governance of social dilemmas. His work has appeared in journals such as the Cambridge Journal of Economics, Public Choice, and Economy and Society. His latest book, Polycentric Governance and a Good Society, is forthcoming at Rowman and Littlefield. Today, we'll be speaking on the topic of dealing with complexity in macroeconomics, which is based on a recently published journal article of his in the Cambridge Journal of Economics, which I will be sharing the link as a link in the chat later. He'll be speaking for approximately 40 minutes, followed by a Q&A session, which I will moderate, lasting approximately 30 minutes. You may drop your questions over the course of the presentation in the chat function below. You need not wait to the Q&A. I will hold on to these questions and begin posing them to our speaker at the end. Please do note that this webinar session is recorded and will be uploaded on YouTube. So without further ado, Pablo, the time is yours. You may commence. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Brian, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you everybody for being today online with us at the LSE event, which is kind of timely because I think this year is the 50th anniversary of the Road to Serfdom as well of F.A. Hayek. So I think it's a very interesting year to be exploring ideas related to F.A. Hayek. My paper in particularly borrows heavily from his ideas on complexity theory we will be discussing throughout the presentation. So I'll start sharing my screen. Hopefully I will try to do less than 40 minutes to not bore everybody to death. This is my, can you guys see my presentation, right? Yes, okay, excellent. All right. Please feel free also to leave questions in the chat if everybody wants to leave questions as long during the presentation so we can pick them up later. Okay, so my email is there. So if anybody wants to shoot me an email, if you guys want the presentations, I can send them to you. Or if you want to discuss further ideas, I'll be happy to discuss them in private with you guys. Just send me an email. So I was invited by Brian today to speak on a paper that I published. So I'm gonna try to talk about the highlights, the takeaway of the paper, the main message that I wanted to convey across. This paper was based on a chapter of my dissertation at King's College, which is about macroeconomic theory and banking. And so the layout for today, I'm gonna start talking about how complexity is being incorporated into economics. Then what I consider to be the most important properties of complexity based on the ideas of the Hayek, which is why we're in this event. And then trying to explain how macroeconomic models, fail to deal with certain key aspects of complexity, and then hopefully trying to propose way forward in doing macroeconomics when we take seriously these properties of complexity. Okay, so those are what is going to be hopefully the layout of today. So my paper was published at the Cambridge Journal of Economics last year. The origin of this paper was the methodological chapter of my book, trying to explain why I use certain methodologies and not others. So the paper was born out of that, grappling with my own ideas about which are the appropriate methods to deal with macroeconomics, which are the appropriate methods that we should engage in order to illuminate macroeconomic phenomena. So it was born out of the introductory chapter of my dissertation, which I'm also working to hopefully publish as a book next year. And then it became this piece, which Brian will share the link. The paper is open access, so everybody can have free access to it and download it. The paper starts with this quote from this famous quote from Keynes. Keynes in the general theory, he says that too large a proportion of recent mathematical economics are mere concoctions, as imprecise as the initial assumptions they rest on, which allow the author to lose sight of the complexities and interdependence of the real world in a maze of pretentious and unhelpful symbols. So Keynes was a little critical of certain modern, back in his days, approaches to dealing with economics, particularly formalistic methods that are trying to lose sight of certain key aspects of the phenomena we're trying to explain. So I borrow his, I got inspired from that message of Keynes to dealing with my own paper. But in recent times, ever more economists are trying to conceptualize the economic system as a complex order, instead of the old-fashioned way of conceptualizing the system in a well-ordered machine in equilibrium, particularly from the 70s onwards. More and more economists are conceptualizing the economy as a complex evolving system, particularly, for example, the work of Brian Arthur in 2009. So since the mid-2000s, different branches of economics are slowly incorporating ideas of complexity into their own research agendas. However, despite those recent attempts in bringing complexity and ontological ideas into economics, this complexity vision has not yet permeated macroeconomic thinking. So macroeconomics has been a branch of its own that has been isolated from these trends in incorporating complexity theory, incorporating the concepts of complexity into their own models of dealing with macroeconomic thinking. But yet at the same time, a bunch of macroeconomists, famous macroeconomists, have been kind of unhappy with the state of affairs that macroeconomics is currently in. Modern macroeconomic models have been severely criticized by their own practitioners. Caballero, Colander, Kierman, Romer, Stiglitz, a bunch of economists, if you look around, have been quite critical of the state of macroeconomics today. But few attempts yet have been made to incorporate this idea as a complexity in macroeconomics. We're going to explain what complexity is later on. So this is like the state of affairs in econ, in a nutshell. So macroeconomics in general seems to be in a sort of intellectual crisis, in a sort of kind of like a dead end. And several particular important practitioners like Kierman, Stiglitz, Janssen have been severely critical about pointing several problematical features of particularly the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, or most of contemporary models used in macroeconomics. For example, Stiglitz says in one of his papers that DSG models are not good theory. Kierman also has been criticizing agent-based modeling. Paul Romer, in a famous piece that did a lot of noise back in the days, he described macroeconomics as pseudoscience. Koronek as well. So several people has been pointing at this impasse in macroeconomics that seems to be in a sort of intellectual crisis, particularly after the crisis in 2008. This kind of an existential crisis of what macroeconomics should be, whether we're using the right appropriate methods to deal with macroeconomics, or we're in a sort of a dead end. Okay. So that's the state of macroeconomics, which is not particularly bright when you look at the scheme of things in the last few decades, especially after the crisis. And one of the other inspirations from this piece It comes from Elinor Ostrom. He has this phrase that I really like, that says that scientific knowledge is as much an understanding of the diversity of situations in which a theory or its models are relevant as understanding of its limits. So I think it's also important, we need to understand the proper limits of the methods in economics once we try to grasp the nature of the phenomena we seek to explore. So first, we need to understand the nature of the phenomena and then deal with the proper methods to deal with those phenomena, rather than use your preferred methods and impose them upon the nature of the phenomena we seek to explore. We need to start with understanding what the phenomena is, and then tweak or use different methods to deal with those phenomena. Elinor Ostrom probably is like the quintessential figure that did that, right? She engages with several different methods dealing with different aspects of social phenomena, ecological phenomena, etc. So she was like approaching a multi-method approach to economics. And so that kind of idea is the core view of the paper. The core of the paper is then try to like shed light on what are the core aspects of the nature of macroeconomics, and then see if the methods that are currently used fit with that phenomena, to see if is there any incongruences, or understand the proper limits of the methods that are currently being used. So it's sort of like a philosophy of economics / methodological paper inspired in this approach of Ostrom multi-method approach. Okay. And the core message that I want to get across in this paper was that macroeconomic models are unable to represent complexity. They're unable to grasp the central features of complex phenomena. So my paper argues that the leading literature and the formalist methods currently employed in macroeconomics, today they're called ESG models, but most of macroeconomic models in general today are unable to grasp the core aspects of organized complexity and its causal properties. So that poses a big problem, because it suggests that we're using methods that are unable to illuminate the phenomenon. So in a way, trying to say that we're using the wrong methods to understand macroeconomics in general. Okay, and we're gonna show why. I'm gonna show later why I think that is. Okay, so the argument of this paper is this critical examination of the core assumptions underlying these models. Okay, and show how these assumptions within these models are ultimately incompatible with the causal properties of complexity. Okay, I hope that is clear. So the idea is to understand what are the fundamental assumptions done in these models, or like the fundamental structure into which these people think about these models, and to see how these are incompatible with the phenomena we seek to study, to show that probably we should be looking for other methods to deal with macroeconomics rather than these formal DSG models. Okay, so well, then what is complexity, right? So if complexity is being such a big thing in other realms in economics rather than macroeconomics, I think it's obviously important to define what is complexity for the scope of the argument, right? I mean, there are different ways of defining complexity. I like this, the short definition by Herbert Simon. In 1962, he defines a complex system by one made up of a large number of parts that interact with each other in non-simple ways, in a way that they produce something that is more than the sum of its parts, says, right? Examples of complex phenomena are the brain, ecological systems, climate, the order in an ant colony, for example, like the cover of the book, the market order, as Hayek said, right? Human civilizations are also complex orders. So basically, all these complex systems are organizations that require a large number of heterogeneous agents that are interacting in non-simple ways, producing something emergent, so producing something that is larger than the sum of its parts. Okay, Warren Weaver has a similar definition into which he calls organized complexity. And organized complexity for Weaver is that it shows the features of an organization, means that the arrangement generates an order or organizational properties that possesses emergent features. Okay, and he says that there are problems which involve dealing simultaneously with a sizable number of factors which are interrelated in an organic way. Okay, so based on these definitions, and in particular using the ideas of Hayek at the time, I have like this sort of like the 4 causal features of complexity. And this is, I think I'm gonna stop here for a second because Hayek is very important in this idea of complexity. He has a piece back in 1964. Hayek was a professor at LSE, Nobel laureate in 1973. And he has this famous piece in 1964 that he wrote in honor, I think, to Karl Popper, also a LSE professor, called The Theory of Complex Phenomena. And in this piece of The Theory of Complex Phenomena, Hayek tries to like delineate, borrowing also from Weber, trying to delineate what are the properties of complexity, which I think are very important for the scope of the argument we want to make. This piece is republished in the latest version of the book, The Market and Other Authors. If you are interested, I highly recommend that book. Is probably, according to my opinion, the best collection of books on Hayek, collection of essays about Hayek. So if you want to read something about Hayek, that should be the book. But anyway, in that piece, I borrowed that to distill these 4 properties. So basically, what are the 4 properties that I think complex phenomena possess? The first one is that they're composed of heterogeneous elements under specific interactions, right? Which means that organized complexity arises out of a large number of elements that are interrelated with each other in certain specific ways. Not in any sort of way, but in particular ways. They produce certain arrangements, right? Think, for example, in the way the ant colony is organized. An ant colony is an organization of a lot of different ants that interact with each other in specific ways. In which specific way they interact, for example, in ants use pheromones. The ants use like secretions of pheromones to organize their social order, producing something that is bigger than the parts of the ants, right? So they interact only in certain specific way, which is, in the case of the ants, certain hormonal secretions, okay? If you stop that particular way in which they interact, they don't produce an order. So it's parts and a particular way of interaction, a part of a fundamental part of complex phenomena. Second, a second property of complex phenomena is that rules and institutions matter. Complex orders have certain rules or organizing structures that govern the way into these parts interact, okay? Specific rules, specific institutions define the way into which the individual parts interact, also telling you which kind of interactions you can do, prescribing other forms of interaction, okay? And then you can produce an order. The third property of complexity is this idea of emergent properties, right? The notion that when the parts are organized in specific ways, a new emergent property arises that is ontologically and causally irreducible of the parts, right? Something that is bigger than the parts. For instance, going back to the ant colony, if you look at a single ant, right? It seems like almost like a dam, right? Like he's moving around, like almost like without purpose, and it seems like there's no like rationality within what the ant is doing. But if you connect, all the ant network, you will see something that, for example, Vernon Smith calls ecological rationality. The society as a whole has a rationality that is bigger than the parts. Like administering food, providing the food supply for their own survival, even for the tribal, right? But that property, which is an ecological rationality, emerges from the whole system. It's not within the ant, it's in the whole system, right? Similarly, the market order, Hayek said, has this emergent feature of coordination, but arises as an unintended emergent product of our interactions. It's not like we are driving for coordination and efficiency, but rather one of the emergent properties of this complex system is an efficient use of resources and a coordination over scattered knowledge, right? But it's something that emerges, it's not within the parts. There's a famous paper that I really like by Gode and Sander back in the 2000, I think, at JPE, Journal of Political Economy, called allocative efficiency with zero intelligence traders. And in that paper, they're basically saying that the overall efficiency and rationality of the system cannot be derived from the intelligence of the players. In other words, the system is intelligent, but not because the players are intelligent, but because coordinating each other, they generate a form of like collective rationality. But even you can have that collective rationality even without the rationality of the agents. You see what I mean? So there's sort of like an emergent feature. And these are particularly in complex phenomena. It's a relevant feature, okay? And finally, a fourth property is this idea of non-equilibrium dynamics and novelty, which means that because they are based on emergent properties and interactions, these systems are always generating constant and endogenous form of unpredictable ways of novelty and radical uncertainty. So there's no equilibrium within the systems. There's always like generating novelty, adaptation, and unpredictable sources of novelty within the system. The market order being probably the quintessential form of this never-ending form of unpredictable sources of novelty that we don't know what is going to be created. Like the famous example of Schumpeter creative destruction. We don't know what's going to be invented. So it's always a constant form of novelty. Okay, so those are the four properties of complexity. So it results clear that if you take this property seriously, then obviously the macroeconomy as a system seems pretty much like a complex system, right? It seems pretty much like a complex order. And recent literature, Kierman, Holt, Howitt, Wagner, Docent Roventini, other people have recognized that the macroeconomy indeed possess these features of complexity, which means a bunch of causally connected parts, individuals, heterogeneous agents link with each other through monetary interactions. We use something called money to interact in the economy. We are causally connected through these monetary interactions, debt obligations, credit, a system of banking and credit and money that creates a form of a system that is defined by certain monetary rules and banking frameworks and banking institutions that produces an emergent order which is not reducible to the parts, right? We create this complexity called the macroeconomy, but it's not reducible to the parts. It's something that emerges from our interactions, right? The macroeconomy is what we're producing through our interactions in the system based on our monetary interactions. And obviously is out of equilibrium by the way it moves, right? So, for example, Wagner have called this the macroeconomy really resembles an ecology of monetary interaction. It's an ecological system in a way, defined by certain monetary structure and monetary features. Okay, but then these properties of complexity pose a severe problem to linear causation models and standard macroeconomic thinking that treat the macroeconomy as big macro entities, aggregated variables that have some linear relationship with them. The classical way of thinking, for example, between inflation and unemployment, right? There's some form of like a linear, predictable form of relationship between these two aggregated variables, right? This way of thinking. This way of thinking is obviously problematic if we take these ideas of complexity seriously. Okay, so what it appears to be there is that there's an intellectual tension in macroeconomics because the presence of the features of complexity in the macroeconomy make it kind of difficult and methodologically challenging for scientists today to apply coherently statistical forms and formal methods to shed light on the system without at least also using certain assumptions in the models that precede or preclude the properties of emergence, radical uncertainty, equilibrium, and some of the stuff like that, right? So there's like a sort of tension between using formal models and using a statistical rigor and formal rigor by also, casting aside or assuming certain features of the complex phenomena. So there's like what I call in my paper as sort of like a paradox or dilemma in the social sciences and the social sciences dealing with complexity. Because for one part, you want to use, mathematical refinement, formalistic simplicity, formal tractability, but at the same time, using those methods requires certain assumptions that precludes or cast aside the essential features of complexity. On the other hand, you can rely on non-formalistic methods which we try to do less damage to the properties of complexity, which are the ones that we're trying to propose at the end of the presentation. So, for example, I think it's wrong to equate science with formal methods alone, right? The methods of science, the idea of science is to use tools and methods that are appropriate to the object of analysis given its nature. I think it's really wrong to think of science just as formal methods. One of the positivistic trends that happened late in the 20th century is that we tend to assume that only formal quantitative methods are scientific. Whereas in reality, the way to do science is to find the tools which are appropriate to the subject of analysis according to the nature. So first we need to understand the nature of the phenomena, then use methods according to that nature, rather than just assuming there is only one method that should be called science. Okay, so it's more like a scientific approach rather than being just one true scientific method. So Hayek talked about this, especially in his novel lecture, right? He said that attempting to use mathematical and statistical methods when not suitable is not science. He called it scientism back when he got the Nobel Prize. I know that people have written about this, even also Eleanor Ostrom wrote about the same critique. But today, complex phenomena such as the macroeconomy are being forced upon or fitted into the economist's preferred methods rather than the other way around. So macroeconomists or economists start with their own biases about what scientific methods should be, and then force reality into the methods, that rather than studying reality and then finding which methods are more appropriate to that nature. Okay, so we're like inverting the relationship. First, we start with our biases, our preferred methods, and we impose them on reality, whereas it should be the other way around if we follow Hayek and Ostrom's suggestion. Obviously, you might disagree with that. So this is like a tension in most social sciences dealing with complex phenomena. Okay, so now I'm going to focus on the models, the macroeconomic models, and which are their core assumptions. Okay, the reviewed properties of complexity help to shed light on certain key shortcomings or certain tensions in the way the models are built, in the assumptions the models use to deal with this complex phenomenon. Today, it might be very focused about DSG models, but most macroeconomic models in general rely on the same assumptions in order to be tractable, etc., etc. Okay, but in a way, then they kind of like preclude or assume away all the essential features of complexity. Okay, and so what are the core assumptions of these models? In particularly, in my paper, I review three core assumptions in the models. They face three critical methodological and analytical shortcomings in dealing with the properties that we just saw. The first one is this idea of steady state assumptions, which are incompatible with a bunch of the properties we just reviewed. Most of the models, most of the neo-Varasian models, DSG models, all the models that come after the Varasian models, overly rely on this concept of systematic equilibrium or adjustments toward equilibrium, or assume tendencies to revert back to this steady state. This idea of the steady state conceptualization, that the model must come back eventually to this sort of equilibria, are ultimately incompatible with the properties of complexity we just saw, regarding emergent phenomena, regarding endogenous novelty, etc., etc. For example, the problem is that this idea of the tendencies towards equilibrium is incompatible with the ones we just saw. They conflict with ideas of agents' dynamic interactions, emergent order, being sustained through a process of change and dynamic relations. Okay. For example, this quote from Holt says, most of these models are based on this idea of micro foundations. And Holt, for example, says, they are strange micro foundations because they're based on the assumptions of no heterogeneous agents, no interactions, the steady state assumptions, etc., etc. Okay. And the second and third problem with these assumptions, they derive from the same idea of the reductionist atomistic assumptions of this model. The second and third shortcomings of the macro models stem from this idea of the micro foundations, which is a sort of like an unrealistic and reductionist way of seeing the macroeconomic models. Basically, what they do is that they assume a simple representative individual that represents the whole economy. Basically, this is kind of like the micro foundations. They adopt this assumption that the aggregates, the macroeconomic aggregates, correspond to or are represented by these hypothetical choices made by the single isolated representative agent that maximizes certain constraint maximizations. So these macro models are basically rooted in this like individual representative agents, okay, which are they're called the micro foundations. But obviously, this idea of micro foundations is deeply traveling with a bunch of the properties we just saw. For example, Kierman, a famous economist called Kierman, says DSG models are based on the same fundamental building blocks, which are the most important is the idea that individuals act in isolation. All that we have to do to reduce the behavior of the economy to the aggregate or macro level is to simply add up all the behavior of the individuals who make it up. So it's like a multiply and aggregated, expanded version of the single individual. So the representative agent modeling and the DSG modeling assume that the aggregated macro phenomena are just scale-up versions or augmented versions of the original variables that constitute the isolated agents optimization problem. So basically, they just assume that the macro phenomena we were trying to study can be explained just as a blown-up, magnified version of the single individual making decisions, because they're based on this idea of this single representative agent. But obviously, this illegitimately assumes that the macro variables we're seeking to study are equally in the same level of complexity as the representative agent's constraint optimization variable. So there's no ontological and qualitative difference between these two, because they assume they're just the same. It's just a magnified version of the representative decisions made by the single individual. And they say like that will represent the economy. So obviously, when you do that, a bunch of things are put on the side. For instance, the role of interactions don't play no longer any role. The role of money is superfluous because it's just a constraint maximization problem made by the individual agent in isolation. The system of relations becomes superfluous. Emergence obviously is completely cast away because it's just a blown up version of the decisions made by the single individual. And obviously, the idea of institutions no longer play a role. Okay, so these models are built into this like a constraint optimization model of the single individual, which tends to assume away all the properties that we just saw in complexity. And finally, based on these assumptions, obviously, rules, organizing structures, and institutions not play any role in these models. So the third shortcoming of modern macroeconomic models is that they severely disregard social structures, rules, and institutions that frame the way in which individuals interact, right? Remember that in one of the properties of complexity is that the parts must interact in certain ways, and these certain ways are defined by certain rules, by certain institutions that provide the mechanisms into which these parts interact. For instance, in the macroeconomy are bank institutions, bank regulations, central banks, right, that configure how the parts will eventually interact. So these models are built on the assumptions that there's one single representative agent, so interactions are superfluous, man is superfluous, then institutions are pretty much superfluous for the models. So, for example, Axel recognizes that few institutions play important roles in these models today. So by assuming away all these things through building these models, then the reality becomes just one-dimensional. The microeconomy and the macroeconomy are at the same level of complexity. There's nothing in between. There's nothing that allows the micro to become something different at the macro level, because it's just a blown-up version of the isolated individual representative agent choices. So obviously, institutions don't play almost any role, zero role in this kind of models. So obviously, they are deeply incompatible with pretty much all the assumptions, all the causal properties of complexity. And for instance, recently, this piece by Paul Romer. Paul Romer won the Nobel Prize in 2019 or 18 for his work on endogenous growth. And he has this very critical piece on macro, and he says, in the last 3 decades, the methods and conclusions of macroeconomics have deteriorated to the point that much of the work in this area no longer qualifies as scientific research. The evolution of macroeconomics today is something similar to string theory from physics. So obviously he's very critical about the way macroeconomics is being done in the last 20 years or so. Okay, my paper tends to, in a way, arrive to the same conclusions that Paul Romer arrives, but through a philosophical road rather than through a more like a formalistic road that he arrives. But nevertheless, I believe that the core takeaway of both Romer's message and my papers is that the arguments that I've given in my paper concerning macroeconomic models show that there are deep limitations in illuminating the core features of complexity. So there are analytical and philosophical incongruent with complexity. Because obviously they have to assume for tractability, they have to assume the essential the essential properties that make the phenomena complex. But in order to make them tractable, you have to like put aside all the things that are important to the phenomena. So so I think that the critical problem can be summarized as Colliner and Cooper's put in a different paper. It says, in order to make the DSG models tractable, they have to assume away almost all the elements of complexity. Okay, so macroeconomists are negating the existence of the four properties of complexity to create their subject matter. Okay, so I believe that hard-risk analytical problems arise whenever we use abstractions not to simplify things along inessential dimensions, but as the way to negate reality itself, disregarding its causal elements, right? Because people will tend to say, well, but obviously all models and all frameworks of science will have to rely on certain assumptions, right? We always deal with abstraction. We have to abstract from reality to make it tractable, to make it understand reality. Obviously, we have to have a certain degree of abstraction, and we have to assume certain things away. Is an irreducible part of doing sciences. But at the same time, the problems arise when you abstract yourself not along inessential, unimportant dimensions, but when you abstract yourself from the essential elements that make the problem what it is, right? So if you start assuming away interactions, money, monetary institutions, emergence, then almost you're rejecting what you're trying to study. Basically, you're not doing what you should be doing, according to my view, okay? So it's not that I'm against abstraction or models, but I believe that the current way in which models are being used, they are abstracting themselves in the things that we should be studying rather than the other way around, okay? So where does that lead us, right? So if this is an inaccurate way to study this phenomena, then in the closing part of my paper, I present alternative way forward. With this, I'm almost done with my presentation. So what I argue for in my paper is similar to what Ostrom did in her own work, trying to advocate for like a multi-methods approach, a more political economy, institutional orientation to macroeconomics. Because I believe that we should apply the methods of analysis based on the nature and the properties of the material in the study instead of vice versa, right? The study, Hayek has this quote that I like that says, the study of economics needs to be guided in the choice of its methods in the main by the nature of the problem it has to face. So first we need to understand the nature of the problems, their compositions, and then choose the methods more appropriate to it, rather than the other way around, which is why it's currently happening in macroeconomics. If you read here it says, they rely on mathematical theory in which facts end up being subordinated to the theoretical preferences of the review leaders. So in this quote, Romer is basically saying the same thing that Hayek was saying 50, 60 years ago. Hayek is saying the same thing in this passage, right? We need to choose the methods based on the nature of the problem rather than impose our preferred methods on the nature of the problem. okay, which is one of the problems that macroeconomic methodology is being done for the last 20, 30 years, which is why Romer is saying that it's no longer science, okay? So what I advocate for in the last part of my paper is for this a realist orientation towards institutions and comparative analysis. So basically, a political economy of money and banking, other forms such as behavioral and experimental macroeconomics, historical and empirical case studies, natural macro experiments, analytical narratives based on central banks, comparative institutional analysis of different banking rules, different banking frameworks using comparative institutional analysis to understand, which monetary rules, which monetary institutions work better or don't work better in generating the macro phenomena we want. Okay, and also finally, there's also space, I believe, for agent-based models, computational modeling that use agent-based modeling of the economy to try to understand macroeconomic dynamics. Okay, so what I think I have in mind are for a little just show what I have in mind, particularly, for example, the work of Christina Romer and David Romer, that hopefully they will probably won the Nobel Prize soon. They do like a historical analysis based on like Milton Friedman and Anna Jacobson Schwartz kind of framework. Or Calumidis and Haber, Fragile by Design, they use like a banking history. Or Betke and Salter, they do like a comparative institutional analysis, analytic narratives in macro. Other people, for example, Brian Arthur, also is advocating for similar turn. Richard Wagner also has a system theory approach to macroeconomics. So there are different ways into which this can be done. Obviously, if we believe in multi-methods, I don't believe there's only one way of doing proper macroeconomics, but I do believe that the message of Romer tells a lot about the state of how macro should be done for the future. Okay, so with that, I think I did my time. So thank you so much. And that's my email. So if anybody has wants to send me an email, please do.
Thank you very much, Pablo, for the great presentation. So I encourage all of you now to drop your questions in the Q&A function below, and I will be selecting them and posing them to our speaker. Perhaps, Pablo, allow me to start with some questions of my own, because obviously this is very related to my interest and research. I have actually three questions which are related. The first one is a bit more methodological, particularly the role of individual choice and agency within complex systems, particularly the debate between methodological individualism and holism, right? So this perspective, this liberal complexity perspective, if I may use the term, the Hayekian perspective here that you are presenting, to my understanding, according to how I understand it, cannot be easily pigeonholed in either one of these camps, right? Because in this perspective, the individual has agency, but he cannot determine and shape the complex environment around him. And these social structures affect and embed the individual, but does not fully determine his actions as well, right? So there is a dynamic dance and interplay between individual agency and social structure, right? So it's not like a dualistic thing. It's actually a third perspective. I call it a dynamic action perspective, if I may use the term. So that's one. The second question I have is about this contrast people like to give between Keynes and Hayek, right? They are like some great rivals in macroeconomics. But actually, if you think about their methodological writings and stance, actually, they would agree a lot with each other, right? In terms of the abuse of models today. In fact, if you think about post-Keynesian economists and some Austrian economists, they will actually agree a lot on the nature of complexity and the need for eclectic approaches, to study the macroeconomy. So I find that to be interesting, which is usually lost in popular discourse, which puts Hayek on one camp and Keynes on another, right? And if I may just ask my third question, which is the difference between rules and regulations, right? Because they sound the same, but actually they're different, right? So today there is this perspective if I may say, Joseph Stiglitz recently presented, a picture of neoliberalism, which Hayek's an architect of, as a society where, we do not want any rules, there is a lack of regulations, right? So in the absence of regulations, it means that, there are no rules. But obviously that's not the case, right? So what we are advocating here is not the absence of regulations, but actually the recognition that people are embedded within rules. So it strikes me that the people who just think of rules as regulations, they are the ones who actually have an impoverished understanding of the richness of rules,
Mhm.
within which individuals are embedded within,
Yeah.
right? So yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'll pick there's also two questions in the Q&A.
yeah.
Yeah, so the first one, methodological individualism. Yeah, I think you're right. And I think also Hayek tend to move into a more complex way of seeing methodological individualism, because people tend to think, like Hayek coming from the Austrian school or something, he will be a hardcore methodological individualist. But I think if you read his pieces from the 60s on, he has a more nuanced, a more complex way of understanding methodological individualism. It's not only that individuals have, their own choices, and everything can be explained to the individuals. In fact, his paper on complexity, he says that, given that we have emergent phenomena, there are certain phenomena that cannot be explained to the individual parts, such as macroeconomic phenomena. So there's a bunch of phenomena that, like the coordination in the market order, cannot be derived exclusively from the part. And also the structure, as you say, the social structure has a role, and they have an interplay. Individuals affect the social system, and the social system affect the individuals. So it's a way of like they're mutually affecting each other. We can change the social system, but also the social system as well shapes us. Okay, and I think the person that has done this more into like understanding this is Richard Wagner. Richard Wagner has done a lot of this, trying to be more nuanced in the way methodological individualism should be understood. And I think I also come from like a public choice perspective. So I used to be more hardcore individualist in the sense of, the public choice kind of school. But reading Hayek and understanding complex phenomena has made me more aware of the nuances into which not everything can be explained to the individual. Methodological individualism needs to be more understood in a more gray zone, because these interactions, as you said as well. So I think is definitely this kind of work in complexity theory makes you less of a hardcore methodological individualist, but for good reasons, when it should be. Where we deal with micro phenomena, obviously you can do hardcore methodological individualism, but when you're dealing with complex systems, I think there are certain features that cannot be reduced to individuals alone. Okay. Also, going back to your question about Hayek and Keynes, yeah, I mean, in a way, they were also friends in a way. During the war, Keynes hosted Hayek when London was being bombed. Keynes, did a lot of help to bring Hayek back to Cambridge and find him a place to stay. So they had like a little like a love and hate relationship. But yes, I agree that heterodox economists like post-Keynesians, or like people that come from like this more Keynesian sort of approach, tend to agree with the Austrians about how we should deal with like complex phenomena. Both of them are critical of formal methods, although I'm critical in a different way. But for example, this paper was published at the Cambridge Journal of Economics. I come mostly from like a Hayekian public choice perspective, and Cambridge Journal of Economics is more like heterodox post-Keynesian journal, but they were very sympathetic with my approach. And I think there's some similarities. I mean, if you read, if you need Keynes' tract on probability, and if you read Keynes, the general theory, he has a very similar methodological approach to economics as Hayek did back in the days. Okay, so I think there's some commonalities there that are interesting to explore. I tried to deal with that in my paper a little bit, but I think one of the problems that I have with certain aspects of the heterodox community of economists is they're way too critical of all the methods, whereas I'm more Stromian. I embrace multi methods. I think a bunch of different methods are good. They illuminate different things, like using analytical narratives, using historical empirical data, using agent-based modeling are different valuable ways of shedding light of different aspects of the phenomena. Like I still believe, valid what Friedman and Schwartz did in understanding the Great Depression, just because they use regressions and stuff. It's not that something I would say like they're using numbers. It's the wrong way. That's not like the way I see my claim in my paper. So I it's more an invitation for understanding the limits of each method and using methods according to what we want to study in the phenomena. Okay, so it's more like a way of understanding where are the limits and hence embracing this sort of multi-method approach in macroeconomics. But that I think it should be embraced by economists. Although most of the macroeconomic community is like a little bubble that hasn't been open to these complexity approaches. And finally, your idea about rules and regulations, I think is very important because regulations shape how the systems work. For example, I find one of my favorite books on this is this book by Calomiris and Haber that let me show you my slide. So in this book, for those interested in banking and macro, this book by Calomiris and Haber called Fragile by Design, basically, can you see the slide, right? Okay, so there in that book, basically what they say is that banking systems are not prone to failure per se all the time, because people assume that the economy is always prone to crisis and blah blah blah, and banking systems always collapse. They say no, some banking systems collapse way more than others, and the reason is bad regulation, bad rules. Bad rules make bad banking systems and hence create crisis. So rules and institutions and regulation plays a huge role for good or for bad. But the point is to understand, to compare rules. Which regulations were better, which regulations were worse in creating the macroeconomic phenomena we want to create. Obviously, we don't want to create banking panics, banking crises, and banking collapses. Hence, we should study historically regulations that have worked well. One of the most striking examples that they use, they say, for example, they show the history, like 200 years of history of banking history in the US compared to 200 banking histories of Canada. And basically in Canada, they never had deep, prolonged banking crisis, whereas in the United States, they had more than 20. And it's like, how come if banking systems are so unstable, so prone to crisis, how come in Canada they never had banking crisis and macroeconomic crisis, whereas in the US they have like 20? The answer can be attributed to rules. Good regulation, bad regulation, good institutions promote good emergent phenomena. Bad institutions and bad regulation promote bad emergent phenomena. So which is why my approach is more of an analytic narratives, comparative historical approach to understand regulations, as you said. Now we can go to the questions in the
Yes,
chat.
that's right. So for those of you who still have questions, please do drop it in the Q&A function. I will select them in order. So let me just start with the first one by Vicente. I'll just read it out for you, Pablo. Apart from the complexity critique very well treated here, I asked about Hayek's knowledge critique as exposed in Economics and Knowledge, his paper, and Competition as a Discovery Procedure. This seems to be a more profound difficulty on formal methods in statistics, since it questions the very idea of data in social science. Hayek says that given that the causal/empirical element in economics that people follow rules and learn, the validity of the theory of competition can never be empirically verified for those cases in which it is of interest. Do you see these stricter limitations in social science of formal and statistical methods, or do you think this critique is not well founded?
That's a good question. I've kind of like grappled with in my own way of thinking about what are the proper methods. Obviously, yeah, if you follow, right, Hayek has a piece before Economics and Knowledge. I think it's called the something about the social sciences, slightly earlier than Economics and Knowledge. I mean, he says basically what Vicente is saying, right? That given the subjectivity of the way with people interact, there's not really data, there's only just subjective things. But I think going to that road would lead us sort of like a very nihilistic way of there wouldn't be social science. They will be just like, why, how should you study something if it's something, everything is subjective? I think you will go into like a postmodern, following that Hayek, you will follow in like a sort of like a postmodern nihilism into which there's no social scientists. It's just, well, you, Brian, believe this, you, Vicente, believe that. We cannot say what is true, what is false, right? And I think I I have my own misgivings to following that road all
Yeah.
the way. Although I think obviously
Mm.
Hayek has a point, especially when applies to social planning,
Yep.
planning the whole economy. I think those points are entirely valid, as Vicente was saying.
Yeah.
But I think
Yeah.
taking that all the way and saying we shouldn't be doing we shouldn't do that data collection, or we shouldn't analyze macro
Yeah.
aggregates. um I would stop halfway there,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So I think the paper you may be thinking of is called The Facts of the Social Sciences, right?
Yeah.
Where he talks about how the facts of the social science are what people think and believe, right? So I think,
Okay.
if I may push back a little on what you said, I don't think it may necessitate nihilism, but I guess to be more sociologically informed, right? Qualitative methods, the use of sociology, the use of ethnography, I think would be very much in line with what Hayek calls the facts of the social sense being what people think and believe, which is something that may not be always reducible to quantitative numbers. But of course, what you have said is does make sense as well. All right, so let
I think,
me,
yeah,
yeah, go ahead. Yeah,
and I think this goes back to the Elinor Ostrom approach. I think,
yeah,
like, for example, complex phenomena that have so many different layers, you can use different approaches to different parts of the problem.
that's
So
right.
for example,
That's
she
right.
was using, like computer models, experimental models,
Yeah,
social ethnography. She went to the fields in Nepal,
yeah,
but she was also doing laboratory experiments, or like regressions. So I think all of
that's right.
them all of them can contribute to some extent.
That's right.
I wouldn't cast them aside completely. But
Yeah,
when you do the
yeah,
opposite, macroeconomists are doing the opposite, in the sense that
that's right.
macroeconomists are saying there's only one method, all the other methods are invalid, and we should keep doing what we're doing, and we're going to be fine. I think
That's
that that has led macroeconomics to a dead end, to a form of like there's no longer science, as
yeah.
Romer said.
So it's really the application of polycentrism to
Right.
economic and social science methodology itself, and
Yeah.
not just in public policy.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. The next question is by Noah, who says, do you see a future where macroeconomic models can more accurately represent complexity? Is it a case of improvement or abandonment for these models?
That's a good question. I think, in my view, I think it should be an abandonment of that kind of approach to dealing with the problem. I think, as Romer said, I think there are, in a way that is like what happened to string theory. I don't know if you are guys familiar with what happened to physics with the string theory. Now that everything is plausible in this like mathematical worlds, and it's just basically a game. It hasn't become they're not trying to illuminate reality. They're just trying to like make absurd claims, and it became sort of like a game for people that play within that realm. So I think macroeconomics has, in the last 2 decades, 3 decades, have slowly become a sort of like a string theory kind of approach, into which like this own community are doing what they're doing happily and protect themselves, and they haven't been creating much insight, and particularly after the 2008 they got really into really questioning, but they are in the like business as usual model. And I think it has created an intellectual crisis, as Lakatos, in the Lakatonian and in the Kuhnian sense, into which like we need to like change the way into which we're doing the things. But unfortunately, I think, and here comes like public choice aspects, incentives and power plays. These people doing these models come from the best schools. They have the best journals. They have the best places in central banking positions, and obviously they don't want to change the way they're doing things. So obviously, they're in the more practical sense. Obviously, there's more like a public choice incentive problem in saying, okay, if they're wrong, then how we change the structure, and that's a very difficult problem for sciences today, right?
Great. All right. So the next question is by Aryan, who asks, Hi, Dr. Pablo. Looking at the interactions between individuals and complexity of the phenomena, I was wondering about how Hayek's tacit rule-following theory is relevant in today's world, and whether or not it is a key factor in the changing of social norms, in changing social norms. Yeah.
I mean, in his the idea of complex phenomena, Hayek was always emphasizing the role of rules, in the role of institutions, because they shape institutions shape the rules into which the players will interact. Um, and to some extent, in some aspects of social phenomena, written rules are not the only ones that we follow. We follow certain tacit rules, or certain, sometimes even we don't believe we're following rules, and rules are generated through the facts that we interact, right? Some rules will emerge, and they become like basically task rule following. So I think in some phenomena, not I don't think not in the economic world, but in some other social realms, like the family, social interactions, right? And I think we are pretty much tacit rule followers. We follow rules even if they're not written, and I think that's very important. Those kind of tacit rule following, or rules that are non-written, I think are very important in, for example, development, in governance systems, right? In governance systems, these kind of rules are really important. And I think, again, back to Ostrom, she was putting a lot of emphasis in this. And I think there's also an overlap between Hayek and Ostrom here, that these tacit rules, these rules that are not written, are really fundamental parts of making governance systems work. But going back to the economy, I don't think in economic in the macroeconomy, in economic terms, I don't think tacit rule following or unexplicit rules are that important, whereas compared to the written rules. And I think written rules are really important in banking, in monetary policy, in the economy. But in other realms, such as governance, ecological resources, social dilemmas, and I think in those areas, tacit rules, unwritten rules are really, really, really important.
Great. Thanks, Pablo. So let me just do a last call for any final questions. If I may just give it a few seconds here for anyone to drop in any last final questions for our speaker. In the meantime, may I remind everyone that our next webinar is on the 30th of July, which will be focused on the topic of nationalism. I have dropped the link in the chat function. Please do check that out. Um, any final questions? It seems there are no other questions. So thank you very much, all of you, for joining us today for this LSE online webinar. Thank you very much, Pablo, for your great presentation. Do check out Pablo's paper. Do feel free to contact him, and also see all of you on the 30th of July for the next session. Thanks, Pablo.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. And everybody has my email, so I'll happy to talk with you guys. And the link of the paper is in the chat as well. So thank you, Brian, for the opportunity, and thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you very much, and have a nice day, all of you.
Have a great day.